Hi everybody, welcome to the session on the impact of COVID-19 on businesses. So as with all the previous sessions, all presenters will have 20 minutes to present their work with 10 minutes for Q&A after each talk. So if you have a question, please use the Q&A facility at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions, and you will then be invited to ask a question at the end of the talk, and we'll be able to unmute your microphone. So please introduce yourself, stating your name and affiliation. And please note that this session will be recorded. So our first presenter for this session will be Catherine Buffington from the US Census Bureau. So over to you, Catherine.
Thank you so much, Claire. I am having some video difficulties, so I'm going to start my video to at least say hi and introduce myself before I start sharing my screen. I think I'm going to have to ultimately turn it off because everything is lagging. So I do apologize for being off camera. Let me do that real quick. I think I am sharing. Can you see my screen? Yes?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, we can.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Sorry about that. So I want to thank Claire and Sarah both for having me here today to talk about the perspectives from the United States Census Bureau's Small Business Pulse Survey. I do work in the economic programs area of the Census Bureau, and in 2020 served as the survey director for the high frequency survey during the pandemic. I wanted to note up front that any opinions that I express are mine and not necessarily those of the Census Bureau, and that all of the data that I use in this presentation are available for download from the public-facing website and have been reviewed to ensure the confidentiality of all of the businesses that participate. Oh, well, let me go into full screen mode here. See if this helps. I'm having a little bit of, let's see, page down problem. Okay, so the Small Business Pulse Survey focused on small businesses. Small businesses in the United States cover about 40% of employees. They are important in terms of being a source of employment, but also are the focus of many programs that the federal government sponsors. We decided that at the beginning of the pandemic that it was important to measure at a high frequency the effects of the pandemic on these small businesses. And we sort of mid-March began planning the survey, and by the end of April of last year had it in the field. So we do collect data on a weekly basis in 9-week phases. We've conducted 4 of these phases, so 36 weeks of data, and we're getting ready to launch our 5th phase next week. So just as a little bit of background on the survey itself, we focus on single location employer businesses with fewer than 500 employees. We had to conduct the survey completely electronically using email addresses that we collected on our 2017 economic census. We were very unsure of the response rate for the Small Business Pulse Survey, it being the first survey that we conducted using only electronic contact methods. And we were also really interested in producing a lot of detailed data, both at the industry level as well as at the geographic level, so states and metropolitan statistical areas. So we actually built a huge target population of about 1 million small businesses to be in our panel. We split up that 1 million businesses into each of the 9-week phases. Each week of the panel is representative at the national level as well as at the sector level. And they are representative of nearly 5.6 million small businesses in the US. Because the survey was online, and we wanted it to be as easy as possible, both to increase the voluntary response to the survey, but also to impose as little burden on business owners during the pandemic as possible. We optimized it for mobile devices. We made sure to only include between 15 and 20 short questions, and we made sure that no records of the business would need to be accessed in order to complete the survey. So there's a lot of departures from the way that we normally conduct business surveys. The survey has some distinct strengths and as well as limitations. Any time the Census Bureau embarks on a survey, we ensure that it is nationally representative as well as representative at other levels of publication. we have the ability to cover all private non-agricultural sectors of the United States. And I'll note too that our methods and the shortcomings itself, we are transparent about the methodology and the data shortcomings, as well as providing estimates of survey error. Some of the limitations, we do not include non-employers, which represent a large share of the small businesses in the United States and represent a disproportionately large share of businesses owned by minority business owners. Like any survey, it's subject to kind of survey bias or selection bias, and this is especially perhaps troubling if we think that people who are more or less likely to respond to an electronic survey are different somehow from those that do choose to participate. During the pandemic, we know that the survey is subject to survival bias. That is, the businesses that continue out throughout the panel or the repeated panels, right, may be fundamentally different from those that drop out of the panel. And finally, we do not account for business deaths or exit during the panel. Then the last thing I'll note is one of the things that I think you'll see when we kind of walk through some of the data charts is that doing research using what is qualitative data has some limits. And I think that qualitative based data is an important thing to collect and has a place in the dialogue about what's happening in the economy, but it probably falls somewhere between kind of anecdotal data or case study data and more quantitative data that we produce. Okay, so just briefly, the Small Business Pulse survey sort of was conducted as a narrative. It is short. It is, like I said, it's about 15 to 20 questions. Some questions remain on all phases of the survey for all of the panels, so 36 weeks of data. We have on the overall effect of the pandemic on the business. This is a Likert scale response with ranging from a large negative effect to neutral to large positive effect. And every survey closes out with a question about expectations or outlook on how much time we think until the business will return to normal levels of operation. In between those bookends, we ask questions about the business's operations, challenges that the business might be facing. Many of those are pandemic related, as well as finance questions, including liquidity and receipt of federal assistance. So I've kind of gone over quickly sort of the survey design and some of the kind of content that we've collected on it. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what can we actually learn from high frequency qualitative data? What are some of the kinds of things that we can learn? So I mentioned that the survey, pardon me, opens with a question on overall sentiment or the overall impact of the pandemic on the business. And I noted it was a Likert scale ranging from large negative to large positive effect. So we convert that question into an index that ranges from -1 to 1, with -1 being large negative effect and +1 being large positive effect, 0 being no effect. And I guess the first thing that you'll note is that throughout the pandemic, so from late April of 2020 until mid-April of 2021, the index ranged from -0.7 to -0.4. So that even though you see a pattern of strictly improving or neutral business sentiment in America over the course of the last year, it's still a negative value, so that all of these things are relative to 0. So sort of widespread negative effect of the pandemic on small businesses in the United States. I'll note briefly that the gaps between the 4 lines are the 4 weeks between each 9-week phase where we do not collect data. This time is spent using to kind of retool the survey instrument, retool the processing programs, give the staff a break, and to prepare for the next collection in our website. So I showed you the national overall sentiment. And I guess kind of shifting to drilling down into what the survey can tell us, we expected a lot of geographic variation in our data. We knew that there were large differences in policy responses across the states, including shutdown orders and capacity constraints being applied differentially across the states. And we also knew that there were sort of large differences across states in terms of COVID, in terms of positivity or hospitalizations and death. And so the box and whiskers chart on the left does show you that for the first 3 phases of the Small Business Pulse Survey, the first 27 weeks, that there is a large amount of variation across states each week. But what we see here on the right side, which is the box whiskers plot of the overall sentiment across sectors, is that there's, in any given week, there's more dispersion across sectors than there is across states. And the second thing I'll note is that this dispersion in sectors, in sectoral variation, and it increases over time, which was a little bit surprising to us. I guess we supposed that the state variation would be larger than the sectoral variation. That was our prior. So this is just a time series plot of the overall sentiment index across time and sectors. That's just another way of thinking about the right-hand box and whiskers plot. And I wanted to highlight sort of 3 bold lines on the chart. The top level bold line, I'll use my mouse here, it's in black and it kind of runs across the top of it, represents the finance and insurance sector. The middle bold line, which is hot pink, is the national average. And then this bottom bold line, which is green, represents the accommodation and food sectors. And so what you'll notice that generally speaking, all of the sectors in the US economy, all the private non-agricultural sectors, sort of follow the same trend from phase to phase, with a period of, sort of a large negative shock at the beginning, with a period of improvement over the first 2 phases, some plateauing or even a dip in the winter on the 3rd phase, and then a gradual improvement this late winter into early spring of 2021. What you'll note is that while everyone sort of follows the same trend and there's a great degree of dispersion in the overall sentiment, that where you are in the ranking has persistence. That is, food and accommodation and other services like education and arts and recreation started low in terms of overall sentiment and remained low, whereas sectors such as retail and construction and finance and insurance stayed relatively high in terms of sentiment, and that persisted. So there is persistence in where you are in the distribution according to sentiment. So just to do a little bit of a dive into what's happening within accommodation and food services, sort of our worst ranked sector in terms of sentiment compared to finance and insurance, I'm going to walk through 2 concepts, revenue and employment. So on the Small Business Pulse Survey, we have a variety of different time periods that we talk about. The overall sentiment question is sort of the experience of your business since the onset of the pandemic. Our revenue and employment concepts, instead of being since the start of the pandemic, are actually on a week-to-week basis in order to try to get at that high frequency statistics component of the survey. And so the question asks, in the last week, did you experience a change in revenue? And the answers are yes, increase, yes, decrease, or stay the same. So what these 2 time series are the share of businesses that report an increase in revenue in the last week or a decrease in revenue in the last week. And so this top line here, which is red, is the decrease in revenue. The bottom line, which is green, is the increase in revenue in the last week. And the same is true for the graph on the right. So what we see generally across all sectors is that in late April of 2020, businesses were facing a large negative shock, sort of economy-wide, and a really large share of businesses in all sectors reported having declines in revenue. So with food and accommodation, this started at about 75% of all businesses, and in finance and insurance, it was nearly 70%. So the large shock applied to most sectors, most businesses across all sectors. During the first phase of the survey, you sort of have this sort of pincher type movement of the series where more businesses are reporting increases in revenues and fewer businesses are reporting declines in revenues. And this is true kind of across sectors. Then you see in the second phase, which was late summer into fall of 2020, a plateauing of revenue. And then in the third phase of the survey is where you see things sort of to start oh, I did it again, start diverging, where revenue in food and accommodation, the declines had a huge increase in the winter, whereas in finance and insurance and other sectors, you continue this plateauing behavior. Then last, in the fourth phase of the survey, you see the share of businesses with declining revenues begin to fall as the US economy enters what we think is a recovery phase. And you see the increase in the share of businesses reporting an increase in revenue increase during this last phase, so sort of spring of 2021. So I guess what I'll note here is that although the sectors kind of started out the same in spring of 2020, they quickly diverged, with food and accommodation services faring much worse as the pandemic dragged on, and finance and insurance sort of plateauing. You see a greater signs of recovery in food and accommodations than in finance and insurance, but this likely just is that there's more ground that needs to be made up. Okay, so what does the Small Business Pulse survey tell us about employment in these two sectors? Well, again, we ask, in the last week, has this business increased, decreased, or not changed the number of paid employees at the business? And what's really interesting is that in food and accommodation services, the patterns of employment adjustment follow that of revenue. So you see at the beginning of the pandemic, large numbers of businesses declining with the number of paid employees at their business. You see it plateauing in the second phase. You see as winter rolls around, businesses reducing the number of employees at their business. And then in the fourth phase, you see businesses entering into a period of recovery where they begin to hire additional employees. You don't see this pattern in the finance and insurance sector. And instead, what you see is at the beginning of the pandemic, a noticeable but small number of firms reporting a decline in employment, and then a plateauing, but in levels that is much, much lower, and may actually be just kind of a normal level of churn in that sector. And that persists across the remaining phases of the survey. Okay, so these patterns are suggestive of potential labor hoarding going on in certain sectors, but we know that these are very preliminary findings. Using aggregate data and more research is required. Okay, so those are the sorts of things I think that we can learn from that high frequency qualitative data at the aggregate level, sort of some basic employment and other dynamics, and some possible inferences that can be made. But now I'm going to jump to what do we learn as an agency by conducting a high frequency survey. And I know I'm brushing up against my time, so I apologize. I'm going to say first that there's a huge demand. I think we all knew this and learned how much the demand was. There's a huge demand for high frequency statistics, both through the press, through policymakers. There's been a ton of innovative new high frequency statistics by statistical agencies using surveys, using administrative data, but also by private parties using private party data, third party data. Right? It's huge demand. I think the second thing that I would say that's related to that is, though, although those third party data sources are important and administrative data products are important, there's still a place for survey data, for high frequency survey data in this space. So here I've just shown you from our public facing website a graph of a question that is sort of topical, that is whether or not businesses in manufacturing have canceled or made changes to their planned capital expenditures for 2020. There's really no other way to get at that using third party data, or perhaps there is, and someone more clever than I can tell me later. But what's really interesting is not only one of the things I think that surprised us when this question went out was how stable the estimates are across the 9 weeks of the representative panel. So I think what we've learned is that perhaps for benchmarking that we can use in other products or surveys that the Census Bureau produces, that it may not be necessary to ask this question of all 9 weeks of the panel. We can say kind of with 95% confidence that about 38% of businesses, small businesses in the United States, canceled or postponed their planned capital expenditures in 2020. And that's going to be useful when we start getting our annual data and processing it for our larger surveys. The other thing that we learned was that by coincidence, that the survey and the types of questions we ask on the survey are useful in providing insights beyond just those related to the pandemic. So in late winter of 2021, Texas had a huge ice storm, resulting in loss of power across the state for the better part of a week. And we know that the Small Business Pulse survey was really good at picking up the effects of that winter storm. So on the left-hand side, you'll see that we had huge jumps in Texas of domestic supplier delays, as well as production delays at the businesses. And at the map on the right-hand side, we also see a huge jump in Texas, as well as in some neighboring states, of temporary business closures due to the storm. So I'll close by just noting that the real work around the Small Business Pulse survey, in some sense, has just begun. We have a tremendous amount of microdata analysis to conduct. In the next few weeks, we'll be releasing Small Business Pulse survey statistics, as well as a research paper that assigns owner characteristics to the firm, so we can understand the differential impact of the pandemic on businesses by owner characteristics, including sex, race, and ethnicity. We have program evaluation work that we are in the early days of starting to evaluate the usefulness or effectiveness of federal programs on small business outcomes. I think for years, people will be studying the business dynamics and how the pandemic influenced them. And of course, we have sort of a more methodological studies to conduct on the impact of survey and survival bias on our estimates. And all of these things, I think, will feed into what we hope will be a future high-frequency program. So I'm going to close by just saying there's just a ton of stuff on our website, and I hope that you'll have time to look at it. I'm going to stop sharing and say thank you very much to Claire and Sarah.
Thank you very much, Catherine. That was really interesting. Do we have any questions in the Q&A?
It doesn't look like it. So.
Any questions at the moment? One question from me then. Are you planning on continuing this survey into the future and sort of seeing how it goes?
Yeah, so I think that's sorry for interrupting, Claire. I think that's a really good question. And I think that conducting a survey in the pandemic has been a really humbling experience, right? I think that we all understand that it's really difficult to predict how these things are going to change over time. I think in the United States, there's a certain amount of optimism, right, or wishfulness that in the fall, that things will have improved to the point that something like the Small Business Pulse is no longer needed. So we do have plans to conduct what we think of as, or planning to get approval to conduct what we think is sort of a recovery survey, right? Like closing it out, how things permanently changed due to the pandemic. But we also have a fallback plan for the fall of, of continuing if things haven't recovered. So, it would be great for all of us to be in a position where we no longer need to do pandemic surveys. I think just how I would like to frame that.
Yeah. So we also have a question from Sumit. So, Sumit, can you be unmuted?
Thank you, Claire, and thank you, Kathy, for that. It was really interesting. So I kind of had a similar question. In terms of the sustainability of these poll surveys, but where I was specifically coming from was, I guess, in a pandemic, what we've done in the UK, I guess, is look at things like turnover, for example, or capital expenditure in your last example, like relative to normal expectations, to kind of get a sense of where you are. Because the problem is, if you look at something like what have you done in the last month or the last 3 months, you're just going to get big swings in these types of diffusion indices. But I wasn't quite sure how sustainable that is going forward. So let's just fast forward maybe a year, 18 months, whatever it is. And I wasn't quite sure what the right or most appropriate reference period is. Do you go back to something like a 3-month on 3-month change or month-on-month change? Or do you try to keep some concept of normal and hope businesses can kind of understand what we are looking for as kind of the statistical community, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is sort of like an amazing question that gets at the heart, sort of an existential question, right? Of what are we doing and how long can we do it? And does it make sense to do it? And those are really practical concerns. So I know, for instance, we had to break a lot of our time series of the more topical questions. So in the last week, questions are sort of perennial and we can continually ask them. But we definitely had questions last year in 2020 that were, since March, because we did want to get at that before period and how things are now relative to before the pandemic, right? Before the stay-at-home or shutdown orders. And then as we rolled into March of 2021, right, we had never anticipated that this was going to still be happening a year in the future, right? We had to kind of rework everything so that we did reference sort of this normal. And the longer the pandemic goes on and the longer that businesses have made these changes, right, it's no longer clear what is normal or what is permanent. And yeah, it's a real question. So I think, I just have to kind of pivot back to, we think these in the last week questions are probably likely, if one were going to do a high frequency survey, right, the appropriate time frame. And then just periodically asking these more benchmark type questions. Yeah, but getting back to what is normal, or right, it's not clear to me. And month to month or week to week, or right, that seems like the appropriate time frame for me. But then it requires a lot of contextual information that I think would get lost over time.
Do we have any other questions? Okay, well, I can't see any other questions, so shall we move on? And
yep, that seems great.
Case, yeah. Shall I share my screen and start?
Yes, please.
Okay, so you should be able to see my screen now.
Yes, we can.
Okay, brilliant. So hi everyone, I'm Claire Wilkinson from the Office of National Statistics in the UK, and I'm going to present a longitudinal analysis of a panel of businesses that have responded to every wave of the Business Insights and Conditions Survey between August 2020 and April 2021. So first, a little bit about BICS. The Business Insights and Conditions Survey at the Office of National Statistics, or ONS, was first set up and implemented as the Business Impact of Coronavirus Survey in a matter of weeks, where traditionally the creation of new surveys can take 6 to 12 months. BICS changed its name in February 2021 to the Business Insights and Conditions Survey to encompass all factors impacting UK businesses, for example, the end of the EU transition period or Brexit, and not just coronavirus. However, during a time of great uncertainty, it was essential to provide quick and coherent data on the impact of the pandemic, with data being used in real time by decision makers to identify the strategies needed to respond to the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on the UK's economy and society. The voluntary fortnightly business survey has provided qualitative information on turnover, workforce, prices, and trade, which has offered further insights around these business dynamics. Final results of each wave of BICS are published in the fortnightly bulletin and weekly faster indicators bulletin on the ONS website. The BICS results and outputs also receive wide coverage from organisations such as the Bank of England and National Institute for Economic and Social Research, but coverage also extends to the news and media, where BICS is quoted on a regular basis. While extensive user consultation about the questionnaire topics was not initially possible due to early time constraints, over the course of the different waves of BICS, ONS worked closely with policy and analytical leads in many different government departments to help identify priority topics for new waves of BICS. So as I mentioned just now, BICS is a fortnightly survey and questions are reviewed and updated as part of each fortnightly wave. We now have final results of 29 waves, which collect responses from businesses during a certain time period, as you can see in the table here. The sampling frame used in BICS was designed to achieve adequate coverage of the listed industries from the monthly business survey for the first 6 waves. However, the sample size was increased over the waves to improve the coverage of regions and different business sizes to ensure the sample was more representative of all UK businesses. These increases have allowed us to further break down the industry data and produce more granular regional data to meet user needs to better understand the impact of local lockdowns. As you can see, BICS has now been running for well over a year, allowing for longitudinal analysis to be at the forefront of our research in determining the impacts of coronavirus and other economic impacts on UK businesses. Longitudinal analysis will therefore have many advantages in being effective at determining the variable patterns over time and being flexible to include different variables as they've been introduced in the survey. So the following analysis considers a panel of businesses that have responded to every wave of BICS over an 8-month period, from August 2020 to April 2021, covering waves 13 to 27 of BICS. This longitudinal analysis has been done to provide additional insight to the regular fortnightly analysis of the full BICS sample, where the regular BICS data is weighted by either business count, turnover, or employment, depending on the variable, which provides valuable insights of the impacts of coronavirus, for example, on the wider business community. But here we use a panel of the same businesses responding over multiple waves to really pinpoint business opinions and how they have changed over time without the sampling error or noise from different businesses responding at each survey wave. This analysis therefore doesn't give a weighted figure as we track the same panel of businesses through these 15 waves, and caution should be taken as tracking this panel of businesses may not then be indicative of the overall business community. And also, due to the routing in the questionnaire, only certain businesses answer some of the questions. So the time period, August 2020 to April 2021, was chosen as it spans a wide range of coronavirus or COVID-19 related restrictions across the UK, whilst also maintaining enough businesses in the panel for the analysis to be carried out. We also break down this time period into 3 different phases or categories, which are subsequently used in further analysis. So phase 1 includes waves 13 to 16 or August to the end of October, when the majority of coronavirus restrictions had eased across the UK last year. Phase 2 is waves 17 to 20 or October, November to December, where there were very variable coronavirus restrictions with different sort of tier systems, localized and national lockdowns. And then phase 3, when the UK was in its 3rd national lockdown, which covers waves 21 to 27. However, we do just use waves 24 to 27 in the further analysis, which covers February, March, and April. So some of the dates overlap here because depending on the question being asked in the survey and whether they relate to the survey period, which is the time at which the business completes the questionnaire, or the reference period of each survey wave, which is the 2 weeks prior to the collection period. So as I said, we tracked a panel of businesses across the 15 different waves. This first table shows you the industry breakdown of a typical survey wave of BICS. Here on the left, with some variation between the different industries covered. We can compare this to the 2 other columns in the table, which in the middle column indicate that there are 999 businesses that consistently responded to every survey wave and are thus included in our business panel. And then on the right is just those consistently responding businesses in the panel that are currently trading, which is 903 of the 999 businesses. So interestingly, 999 businesses represents only 4% of all responding businesses to the survey, all responding businesses of the BICS survey between waves 13 to 27. So comparing the industry panels across the different columns, you can see that the percentages are very similar really for most of the different industries. However, the panel is very slightly lower for the accommodation and food industry and the arts and entertainment industry, with these industries only making up about 10% of the business panel. Another difference between the consistently responding businesses and those that respond to the BICS, the whole BICS survey, are the proportions in each size band. So the percentage of large businesses with more than 250 employees is much larger in the consistently responding businesses than in the sort of Wave 27 sample, which is just used here as an example. This is because larger businesses are sampled every wave, whereas smaller businesses may be rotated in and out of the survey each wave, meaning that they are less likely to be included in a longitudinal analysis. Therefore, this panel of businesses, as I said before, will not completely reflect the wider BIC sample, but is valuable for longitudinal analysis because the profile of businesses is consistent over time. So we looked at 3 different performance or health metrics for the panel of businesses. These include trading status, turnover, and cash reserves to see how they differed from August 2020 to April 2021. So first of all, trading status. Of the panel of 999 businesses, 90% reported continuing to trade in every wave, while 10% reported that they had temporarily closed or paused trading during at least one wave in this period. The graph here shows the difference in currently trading in blue and paused trading in yellow for each wave of the panel of consistently responding businesses, and you can see how the differences in paused trading increase in times of uncertainty or heightened lockdown restrictions in the UK, for example, in November, January, February, and March. The second graph here compares businesses that are currently trading in the panel of consistently responding businesses in blue and all businesses within the BIC survey in orange. The businesses that responded to every survey wave between waves 13 to 27 had a consistently higher proportion, on average 17 percentage points currently trading compared to the weighted estimates of all businesses in BICS. Therefore, businesses in this panel for analysis here are more likely to be trading. This could be due to several reasons. Firstly, that there may be some survivorship bias in the panel of businesses, as they have consistently responded to a voluntary business survey for 8 months, suggesting that they are more likely to do this if they are trading, although 2 businesses did respond that they had ceased trading in every wave. But also, thinking back to the different profiles of the business panel, we suggest this may be because we had a greater proportion of businesses in the panel that are larger businesses and or also in the services sector. So looking back at the industries, only 10% were in the accommodation and food or arts industries, and these are the ones that have had the greatest impacts from the coronavirus-related restrictions. The second metric we looked at for consistently responding businesses was differences in turnover, and businesses comparing their turnover to normal expectations for this time of year. Businesses had to be currently trading in order to answer this question. So interestingly, this graph shows the comparison between this panel of consistently responding businesses and all businesses in BICS that are reporting decreases in turnover compared to what is expected for this time of year. And you can see that they're very similar and following the same trends despite the differences in the business panel. So focusing on just the panel of consistently responding businesses, you can see from the graph here that turnover compared to normal expectations has remained broadly stable, with around 40% of businesses reporting that turnover has decreased, which are the blue bars. However, there is a small percentage of businesses that reported increases in turnover over this 8-month period, and interestingly, this declined from around 11% to 7% from the end of December 2020 until the beginning of February, spelling the early part of the UK being back in its 3rd nationwide lockdown. BICS also asks businesses what they expect their turnover to be in the next 2 weeks. The expectations plotted here on the right-hand side of the graph are very positive and suggest that as the restrictions are starting to ease at the end of March and early April, that the majority of businesses would not have any impacts on their turnover compared to normal expectations. However, businesses might interpret the expectations questions differently, with some answering the question in terms of the next 2 weeks or in terms of their normal expectations for this time of year. However, the question does explicitly state, what are your expectations about your business's turnover in the next 2 weeks? So looking at these panel of businesses that continue to trade, the Sankey diagram shown here is a snapshot of the interactive diagram that is available on the Insight of BICS article on the ONS website. The version on screen shows the flows of responses from wave 13 to wave 27. However, online you can select any wave combination. The flows in the Sankey diagram show the number of businesses who responded to each option of turnover from wave 13 to wave 27, but a business could have responded with any of the other options in waves 14 to 26. So interestingly, across all 15 waves, 62% of businesses changed their turnover response at some stage, with businesses predominantly moving between turnover having decreased and not being affected, or the other way around, as you can see from the lines on the Sankey diagram. Although not on the Sankey diagram, the end of October to early December 2020 had the largest change as businesses moved to report normal or lower than average turnover. And this was when coronavirus regulations were very variable throughout the UK. What this diagram does indicate, however, is the large proportion of businesses responding that turnover has not been affected in waves 13 to 27 by seeing the size of the green bar. However, the blue bars at the top have slightly decreased in size, showing less of these businesses reporting an increase in turnover, and that there is lots of movement between businesses not being affected and each of the categories of turnover having decreased. However, as I said, 62% of businesses changed their responses over time, but this percentage of businesses not consistently responding also changed during the different time periods. So we collated the responses on those responding businesses across the 4 wave periods and the 3 different time phases that I mentioned at the start. So in August to October 2020, 30% of businesses consistently reported lower turnover than normal. This increased to 35% in November and December, and decreased slightly to 34% in February and March. However, across the 15 waves in the analysis that span the period from August 2020 to March 2021, only 16% consistently responded turnover was lower than normal expectations, so they had to respond that in every wave. And 1% of this panel of businesses reported an increase of turnover relative to normal. 18% reported turnover was unaffected, and 3% reported not sure in every wave of the survey. This suggests that some semblance of normal trading conditions have been possible at some times, despite the sort of strict coronavirus regulations. So the third metric we looked at was cash reserves, as one concern that businesses have raised in response to the coronavirus pandemic has been cash flow issues, reflecting the adverse impact on their turnover. By tracking this panel of businesses' cash reserve responses over time, we can highlight businesses' confidence of their own survival during different times of the pandemic. Firstly, looking at this graph with more than 6 months cash reserves in orange and less than 6 months cash reserves in blue, we can see that cash reserves have remained very stable from September to April. However, if we zoom in on the graph, we can see that there is some movement in the data and that there have been 2 small decreases in the more than 6 months cash reserves in orange, which coincide with waves 17 and 22, or the time periods early November and mid-January, which are when businesses were subjected to continued levels of severe coronavirus-related restrictions in either the autumn lockdown or third lockdown in January. So interestingly as well, although not displayed separately on the graph here, this panel of businesses also consistently reported the percentage of businesses having no cash reserves at 2% in every wave in this analysis. However, we know that from the trading statuses that despite having no cash reserves, no business in this panel reported that they had ceased trading. So here is another snapshot of the Sankey diagram of cash reserves from our published article on the ONS website. As before, the flows in the Sankey currently show the differences between waves 13 and 27. However, online you can select any wave combination and businesses can respond differently in any other wave combination. So the darker the blue colour, the less cash reserves the business has reported, with grey being not sure. The Sankey diagram clearly indicates the lack of changes and movements in cash reserves, as only 270 businesses, or 27%, changed their response at some stage during the 15 waves, despite the major changes in lockdown restrictions across this time period. And although only waves 13 to 27 are displayed here, of this panel of businesses, 31% consistently reported having more than 6 months cash reserves, 30% consistently had no or less than 6 months cash reserves, and a further 12% consistently reported not sure. So this indicates, as I said, that the majority of businesses have not changed their opinion of cash reserves over time, and show just how stable they have been for businesses in this panel. So this stability in cash reserves may be explained by businesses using loans and grants offered to help support them through the coronavirus pandemic, or by changing their workforce. Looking first at government-backed loans and finance agreements, which is just one of the finance offers available to businesses in the UK, 25% of this panel of businesses have received a government-backed loan or finance agreement during the COVID-19 pandemic in one or more survey wave between November 2020, when the question was introduced, and April 21. So in total, only 15% responded that they had received a loan or finance agreement in every wave of the survey, and 21% reported that they had received a loan or finance agreement in the last 4-wave time period in February or March. And then since wave 20 or December 2020, businesses were also asked if they expected to make any of their workforce redundant in the next 3 months, to look at how they may be changing their workforce. Responses have suggested uncertainty over staff retention, even among these more stable businesses. 1 in 6 businesses, or 16% in this panel, responded that they had expected to make some of their workforce redundant in the next 3 months in one or more waves between waves 20 to 27. A further 40% stated not sure, either consistently or in some waves, and only 44% of businesses consistently responded that they had expected no redundancies. Therefore, there is considerable uncertainty in staff retention plans, as 4 in 10 businesses have stated not sure, as opposed to having active redundancy plans. So to conclude, trading status shows that these businesses are more active than average as compared to all businesses within BICS, with 90% currently trading throughout the analysis period. And as I said, this is likely due to a survivorship bias, where businesses that are doing well are more likely to respond, but also to the different profile of the businesses sampled. We suggest that this is because these regularly responding businesses are broadly not so impacted by the coronavirus regulations, and this may be because there is a greater proportion of large businesses, as smaller businesses may be rotated in and out of the survey, and or also because there is a smaller percentage of businesses in the entertainment and hospitality sectors that would be the most impacted by coronavirus regulations. And turnover compared to normal expectations provides us with different insights, as 62% of businesses changed their response at some stage across this time period, with businesses predominantly moving between turnover having decreased and not affected, or the other way around. However, it was in November and December 2020 when the highest proportion of businesses reported lower than expected turnover, and the most businesses changed their response status. This may be due to the highly variable and uncertain restrictions that were regularly changing by city, region, and country within the UK. But also, interestingly, this period of uncertainty seems to have had a greater impact on businesses than when the UK has been in its 3rd lockdown under stricter guidance. Businesses also reported general consistency in levels of cash reserves and reported the same levels in every wave between August and April, with no clear shift to reporting reduced cash reserves or this leading to any change in trading status. Like turnover, and as I mentioned, there were 2 small decreases of a couple of percentage points in the proportion of businesses with more than 6 months cash reserves. These decreases in November and January similarly correspond to the heightened coronavirus regulations in place at the time, but the scale of decline indicates that the businesses in this panel did not suffer big losses in cash reserves due to the pandemic. This suggests that these businesses were potentially largely prepared for the level of lockdown restrictions. A second interesting point about cash reserves is that many businesses reported having only 1 to 3 months cash reserves, but over the 8-month time period of this analysis, very few decreased to having less than 1 month or no cash reserves, so we suggest this is likely to be the normal operating status of many of these businesses. This overall stability is likely due in part to the availability of loans and grants, of which 25% of businesses in this panel applied and received. However, interestingly, 75% of businesses therefore didn't receive a loan or finance agreement, which may be because they didn't need to apply or that they didn't meet the requirements for the loan or finance agreement, suggesting that many of these businesses either may not be suffering from the heightened coronavirus restrictions or were not seen as a high enough priority to receive those different loans or grants. And then moving on, staff retention plans also carried some uncertainty even among these more stable businesses, with only 44% consistently saying they had no redundancies in the next 3 months, and therefore more than half of the businesses having considered making some of their workforce redundant at some stage since December 2020. This reflects the ongoing uncertainty, even for these more stable businesses, not only in regards to coronavirus, but also the end of the EU transition period, with possible impacts on trading, imports and exports. And also more widely, that all businesses are trying to reduce and minimise their costs. So this level of uncertainty in their workforce may not be that different from a normal year for some of these businesses. So thank you very much for listening, and the links to both the article that I've presented on today, the longitudinal analysis over time, and our regular fortnightly bulletin are here. So thank you very much. And do you have any questions?
Hi, this is Kathy, and I just wanted to say I found your talk incredibly informative and interesting, and I will go find your article. I wanted to make a couple of points, I guess, before we hand it over to the question and answer. And ask you a question. First, I just wanted to say what I find remarkable is that I feel like we have just very similar experiences conducting a high frequency survey, and there's a lot of overlap with content and findings. So it's just super interesting to me personally. I guess one of the things that you brought up several times sort of was going to be my question, which was it's really interesting to me too that you note that in terms of, say, cash on hand that these businesses experience, that you sort of think you're getting at what normally is occurring, so that a lot of these businesses, say, have 1 to 3 months of cash reserves. And so my question is, do you think that the ONS will continue the BICs to sort of get at what these more normal measures might be like? It is kind of difficult to interpret. I think we saw this in the US data with like finance and insurance, where there's sort of this low level churn of, say, the employment series, right? That we think is probably what normally happens in that sector, but we don't know. And so I guess continuing the survey post-pandemic would maybe allow us to get a better sense of what those normal values are. I'm going to mute.
Yeah, so as far as I'm aware, and as far as the plan is, we're going to be continuing as a fortnightly survey for the foreseeable future. However, it is likely to move to a more monthly survey as things with the sort of coronavirus pandemic hopefully quieten down soon. But yeah, the plan is for it to remain in place as a new business survey for ONS, I believe.
I think that's fantastic. So I'm going to look and do you a favor. I don't see, does anyone have questions for Claire about the BICS longitudinal analysis? I'm looking in the Q&A chat. I don't see any questions. I'll note that I realize this is the kind of one of the last sessions of the conference, and it's probably getting late in the day there. Oh, actually, Jonathan Haskell has a question. Let's see, I guess, I don't know if Sarah, there you go.
Thank you very much. Jonathan Haskell speaking. I'm sorry I came late to the presentation, apologies. Is the micro data behind all of this available? Thank you.
Yes, so all the micro data for every wave of BICs is available through the Secure Research Service, if you're familiar with that. If you're not familiar with it, drop us an email on the bics@ons.gov.uk email address, and we can point you in the right direction to get it.
And a follow-up, if I may, have you sort of collated the time series that you were talking about into some sort of easily downloadable fashion so that we can do it, or do we have to go through wave by wave by wave?
It depends what format you want the data in. So if you want the micro data is not currently collated wave by wave and publicly available.
Yeah.
But our fortnightly bulletin, the full data set is published alongside it, and we're moving more and more to time series data sets within that for each of the different questions. So I think about a third of the questions so far have time series related to them in the data set. So many of them are sort of just on the ONS website, freely available to download, and the data is broken down by industry and size band of businesses. So it depends at what level you want the data, really.
Thank you. And if I could just reflect back on the very interesting discussion you had about, going on and collecting the data. I mean, this would seem to me to be a staggeringly useful data set and very interesting data set. And of course, as we come out of the virus problem, you would imagine a whole set of different questions would emerge around, working from home, ICT, business processes, and all that kind of thing. So it would be fantastic to carrying on, continuing with the data. And asking, new types of questions, as they arise. And I'm not sure whether there's a similar kind of thought process going on in other stats agencies as well. Thank you.
Yeah. So the questions change every 2 weeks anyway. We have a sort of core group of questions, and then others that get rotated in and out. But we've already been asking questions on the end of the EU transition period, net zero, or any other government department can sort of send and request questions that we try to work into the survey as well.
Yep.
Thanks very much. Fantastic. Thank you.
And I just say likewise, in the United States, right, there is we are going through the administrative process of trying to get something more permanent in place and secure funding through appropriations, because we do think this kind of high frequency platform would be useful. I think we find it particularly useful in measuring things like expectations that may be more difficult to do on other platforms. This lightweight, low burden platform is ideal for those sorts of questions.
Sumit's also asked a question. If you want to read it out, Sumit.
Thanks. And this might be both for you and Kathy, and I think it touched upon what her comment just there, which is, I was wondering if you had given much consideration at this stage, kind of how do you maximize the value of high frequency surveys in kind of more normal times? So, and you might have touched upon it in your response there. So what I had in mind was like the turnover ones relative to normal expectations are obviously incredibly helpful when you're in a period of the tightening or lifting of restrictions. But as you move into kind of more, one would hope, more normal times at some point, I didn't quite know if that has the same value or the same impact. But is the answer then you just got to tweak how you ask specific questions, or is it more that you ask more bespoke questions on a fortnightly, monthly basis, and so you're not necessarily tracking net turnover balances, but something a little bit more that gives you business insights? But yeah, it was just that idea in kind of a post-pandemic normal time, whenever that might be. So thanks.
Yeah, do you want to go first, Kathy, or do you want me to?
Oh, Claire, why don't you go first this time?
Okay. Well, I think there's kind of two different aspects to that, really. I mean, we change the questions, as I said, every fortnight anyway, or some get changed sort of over time. So these would be changed, and there would be different questions for sort of more normal times. But also, a lot of these questions provide us with very early indicators of anything that's going on. So we regularly compare kind of net turnover balances to UK GDP figures, which are much more kind of national statistics. So although I think it's unlikely that things in BICS become national statistics, they are kind of early indicators of what might be happening with national statistics. So I think that could be something that's really useful in the future as well.
Yeah, I would second that. I would think that where we've landed are sort of a set of core concepts, fundamental concepts, sort of around revenue and employment that do track in terms of trend and inflection points our national data. So we do think maybe they are good to kind of collect all of the time as early indicators. And again, right, sort of these more topical questions may be useful during periods of economic emergency, right, and emergencies that we can't necessarily foresee, in terms of maybe foreign trade or weather emergencies or climate emergencies, right? So it's hard to anticipate what they would look like. I would add that at least in the United States, we had this huge, like ridiculously large sample of 1 million firms, and we do anticipate kind of like redesigning that to kind of optimize the sample and maybe go for less detail and less data products in the future, kind of during normal times, where it's not clear that we need to kind of burden so many firms and produce so much data on a weekly or even bi-weekly basis.
Thank you so much. Really helpful.
Have we got any other questions, or is that everything? Yeah, I think if that's all the questions, I'm going to say thank you very much to Kathy and to Sarah, who's been hosting. Yeah, I hope you all have a good rest of conference.